What project are we looking at today?
The New Schools Innovation Center.
Okay. And I know that, do you know anything about, I know that the New School has done a lot of renovations lately and they're really kind of rebuilding some spaces. Is this part of that plan, or were you talking about the way that this will fit into their other projects?
The project grew out of a university-wide strategic plan, and part of that was to look at consolidating spaces that would be better off or together. So every use in this center came from 3 different buildings, and then it was combined with media studies activities and uses. So it kind of created a nexus of activity that didn't exist before, and many of these functions were kind of siloed in different places, and it's the first time they've all been brought together. And doing that in 20,000 square feet was a bit of a challenge, but it creates a lively place when everyone's actually here during the academic year.
Great. And then so we had talked a little bit about the sketch, so will you go over what it is that we are looking at?
Every project starts with a grand idea, and when we first came to the 6th floor here, we got off the elevator and there's this amazing view of the window wall facing 5th Avenue. It's just full of light in the afternoon. And so one idea was that we should never interrupt this view when you get off the elevator, and that there should be some sort of cone of vision that takes you down towards 5th Avenue. And that became an organizing element that still remains today. The shape of it tapers so that it's kind of a dynamic space. And crossing that at 3 or 4 different points were these channels of activity. We later referred to those as the rear yards and the front yards. And in the rear yard, you would do messy things that you don't want people necessarily to see or show off. So that's a place where students can make and do, where you can really get sloppy and kind of sit on the floor. There are tables that crank up and down. It's kind of the industrial part of the floor. And then the front yard is the public space, and that's kind of the living room of the center, and where all the labs and instructional spaces have sliding doors, and they spill out onto the common space. So we designed the instructional spaces and high fidelity media labs to be really tight, tighter than you would normally, and we took that extra space and we put it into the commons areas and the rear yard area. So it was really about maximizing the space for mixing academic programs and for students to be able to come and gather and present their make presentations of their projects.
Well, and we were talking about how all of the spaces really have these walls that that are able to be drawn on. Will you speak a little bit about why you decided to go with that?
Well, it's supposed to be a hands-on place, so it wasn't about a institutional feel. It was supposed to be actually a place where you can combine making and doing with digital studies in media and Parsons School of Design as well. So it's all coming together, and we wanted to have as many surfaces that you could scribble on as possible. There are 150 linear feet of writable surfaces, and despite that, behind you right now, I'm looking at a window that students have done a beautiful diagram on, which pleases me a lot because I too, when I was in architecture school, refused to follow the rules. So I think that we've at least achieved that the students feel free to mess up the space.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of the problems that you ran into, and were there any happy accidents?
Well, there are always problems. I'm not an engineer, but something that we hadn't really considered early on was that when we added all these screens, I think there are 18 large format monitors throughout the space, and then there are probably 75 to 100 workstations. Not to mention high fidelity printers for photography, a green room that has a sound isolated control room and audio room. And all of these gadgets add up, and they put off a lot of heat, and they take a lot of power, and the floor wasn't designed for either of those. So we knew we needed to add some additional cooling or it was going to swelter during the spring and summer months. And we discovered to put an air-cooled unit in would kind of punch a wall through a landmark building. It's a historic landmark, so we had to regroup and come up with a water-cooled system to keep the temperature down. So it's not a sexy problem that we ran into, but it was a real problem, and power upgrades had to be made. And some of that infrastructure started to eat up space, and it was precious as we were trying to put all these programs together and have them intersect in creative ways that would keep the space active, but provide enough spaces, little corners and nooks for individual study and areas of concentration and places for introverts as much as places for extroverts to gather and work in groups.
Great, and then we were also talking about how the labs are created with these double glass doors.
Huge doors, which that takes me back to a problem we encountered that some people thought they were to push on. Some people thought they were to slam, so we had one that cracked, and so we developed little rubber gaskets to make the closure softer. But what they're designed for is to allow the labs and instructional rooms and seminar rooms to be much smaller. And so the doors open up really wide, and today's teaching is more about coaching and less about lecturing and having breakout groups. So the idea was that, okay, we're gonna make these spaces smaller, but you're gonna be able to spill out into common areas. So the front yard concept, again, was to allow professors and instructors to have group breakout sessions and go beyond the walls of the labs and classrooms. And in the end, it gave us much more space throughout the floor for gathering and having groups do projects together and make large presentations.
All right, great. And then finally, with all of these designers, you know, designing for designers, even if they're students, it's always a little
tricky.
Yeah. Is there any aspect that you think really, you know, was the highlight that you really think will be the best thing for these students, whether or not they know it?
I think the void is actually the highlight. That we left a lot of branding very quiet. It's almost like a museum setting. It's as flexible as an art gallery, and it kind of freed all these different academic departments to feel like they own the space, and there's enough space that it allows flexibility to have a lecture with a group of 175, or to actually have students present work in a gallery setting. And so I think what we didn't add, the limited use of color, the beautiful hardwood floors, it's kind of a palette that was left for them to make their own. And as I walk around, even in the slow summer month today, you see things that are posted and stickers and tapes and things that the students are making their own. And I think that it's a palette that allows them to be as creative as they want. And it wasn't something overly designed and that they feel like they have to respond to, but they can make their own.